And Lydia's research aims are to improve the long-term quality of life for patients who receive radiation therapy by expanding our understanding of the relationship between physical radiation exposures and their biological effects. And the title of her talk today is Physics, Travel, and Saving the World, One Physicist's Journey to Do all these things. Welcome, Lydia, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm super excited to be here virtually today and have the opportunity to share with you a little bit about my previous work and the path that's led me to this point. Hi, guys, I can see you. Awesome. So this will work. Cool. My objectives for our time together today are to share with you a little bit about my work, mostly about my career path and the research that I've been passionate about along the way, and also a little bit about my life. And also, I will apologize. I'm a little bit sick, so I'm hoping my voice holds out. If I start hacking up a lung, I'm sorry, but we'll get through it together. But most importantly, I'm hoping that I can demonstrate to you the ways that I've found to integrate these two things, kind of my work self and my life self. So let's start out by taking it way back. I grew up outside of Chicago, Illinois, and after finishing high school there, I was looking for a little adventure. So I packed up and moved all the way across the country to attend the University of California, Berkeley. And at that point, my favorite class in high school had been physics, so I naturally decided to study physics. And I was also a musician, so I also got a minor in music. And outside of school, I had really diverse interests. I played the oboe and the orchestra and the concert band and the chamber orchestra. I played tenor saxophone in the marching band. And I've also always really, really loved to dance. And so that drew me to join the color guard and to salsa dance. And if all of that wasn't enough, I also worked through college, mostly in food service on and around campus. And so if all of this doesn't make it abundantly clear to you, I've always really struggled to make decisions. I want to do all of the things. And so when it came time to think about what I wanted to do for a career, I really had no idea what that one thing would be. But what I did know was that I had excelled at physics, that I really valued roles that provide some service to others or that help them in some capacity. And I really love to travel and to explore new areas. So when I tried to think about a job that might encompass all of these things, it wasn't super clear to me, but I thought that maybe working for something like Doctors Without Borders or for the Peace Corps might be a good fit. But that, of course, would be a departure from physics, and that would mean changing course to go to med school, and I wasn't quite ready to jump into that. So rather than just rushing into something that I wasn't positive was the right fit for my skills, interests, and values, I took some time to just live life. And so my friend and I took off to backpack across Europe and experience new places and cultures. And then I ended up living and working again in food service in Australia for a while. And taking this time and space to reevaluate allowed me to realize just how much physics was a part of who I was. I started seeing how analytically I approached the world and how much I craved understanding the underlying principles that guided our world and the people in it. And this time also gave me space to research how I might find better harmony between the things that I loved in life. Namely, that would be working with people and helping them, and also my passion for physics. And that is when I was able to discover the field of medical physics, which just seemed like the perfect marriage of my various interests. And so I moved back to the US to pursue my master's in medical physics at Louisiana State University. And going into my master's program, I was just really excited to get in the clinic. But the LSU program includes a master's thesis. Oops, sorry. And so I had to do some research. And for that, I ended up getting paired to work with Dr. Wayne Newhouser on out-of-field dosimetry. And that might sound a little academic to you guys. So why were Wayne and I interested in out-of-field dosimetry? Well, as many of you are no doubt aware, improvements in cancer care over the past several decades have enabled survival rates to steadily increase, particularly for children, of whom nearly 85% are now able to survive 5 years or more. However, 5 years of survival is a pretty unsatisfying milestone for children. If you think about it, that really only represents whether an 8-year-old patient is going to see their 13th birthday. And so a recent study took a deeper look at this improving survival and found some pretty troubling trends. So here you can see the number of excess deaths among childhood cancer survivors compared to healthy controls versus the year of death if we only look within the first 5 years of diagnosis. So this decrease in excess deaths is just another way of looking at the increasing 5-year survival. These measures are directly linked. But now, if we add in those deaths that are occurring within 10 years of diagnosis and greater than 10 years since diagnosis, we see that we aren't actually doing any better for these patients in terms of true long-term survival. Rather than decreasing, the overall number of excess deaths is staying roughly constant. And instead, it's just shifting to later time points. Now, the study went on to report that most of those deaths occurring a decade or more after diagnosis are related to treatment exposures, with mortality from recurrence or progressive disease rare at those timescales. And then even for those patients who do survive long into adulthood, other studies have shown us that they don't have it easy. So here you can see the cumulative burden of chronic health conditions versus age for a population of childhood cancer survivors shown in blue and a group of healthy controls shown in black. And what we can see is that not only do the survivors of childhood cancer experience a significantly increased burden compared to the healthy controls, but this disparity persists and even worsens across the lifespan of the survivor. A separate study found that those chronic health conditions experienced by these long-term survivors span almost every major organ system. And unfortunately, radiation therapy is associated with toxicities in all of them. And so what all of this is telling us is that whether we're talking about morbidity or mortality, treatment toxicities are critically important to long-term patient outcomes. And studies that are trying to minimize these toxicities rely on us having a deep understanding of the relation between a physical radiation exposure and its biologic effects. And unfortunately, a major barrier has often been gaps in our knowledge of those physical exposures. And those gaps are stemming from where we usually get physical exposure information from, the treatment planning system. So treatment planning systems are software packages that we use, unsurprisingly, to plan patient treatments. And those programs have two primary jobs. So first, they have to calculate the dose from a potential treatment, and then they optimize that dose, trying to place a high dose in the volume of tissue where the disease is located, while keeping the dose in the surrounding healthy tissues low. Once that optimal treatment plan is found, the patient will come in and the treatment plan is delivered. And now this diagram represents a patient receiving standard external beam radiation therapy. So let's see if I can turn on the laser pointer. Okay, so this here represents the patient lying on the treatment couch, and this represents the treatment head. And in red here, we can see the therapeutic radiation beam, or the radiation that's planned to be delivered to the patient to treat their disease. However, in addition to this therapeutic radiation, we have all of this blue representing the stray radiation that just bathes the patient in an extra unwanted dose. Now, the problem is that commercial treatment planning systems are known to underestimate or neglect the absorbed dose from those stray radiation exposures. And here's some quantitative data showing you just how poorly or how incomplete our clinical data are. So on the x-axis, we have position measured from the center of a radiation beam, and the y-axis is the relative absorbed dose shown on a logarithmic scale. These open circles are showing you the absorbed dose for a conventional photon beam that are measured, and then the dashed and dotted lines are showing you that calculated by two different commercial treatment planning systems. What we can see is that while both of the treatment planning systems do a good job of accurately calculating the dose in and near the treatment field, they both underestimate the dose outside of the field and they don't even try to calculate the dose way out here. So some of you might be wondering, so what? Is all of this dose out here even relevant to those toxicities that we're worried about? Well, one toxicity that we're commonly concerned about in long-term survivors is second cancers. And one study found that most second cancers occurred outside of the therapeutically irradiated volume. And nearly a quarter of those second cancers were at distances greater than 5 centimeters from the irradiated volume. So now if we go back to this quantitative data, I've indicated where on our x-axis we get about 5 centimeters outside of our irradiated volume. And you can see that nearly a quarter of second cancers occurred in this area where the treatment planning systems underestimate or completely neglect the absorbed dose. And so this makes it impossible for us to evaluate a relation between a biologic effect and a completely unknown physical absorbed dose. And so the goal of my master's thesis project was to test the feasibility of calculating all of the dose from conventional photon therapy beams. And I also think it's really important to have an idea of what you want to get out of a situation or a position or an experience while going into it. So my training goal for my master's thesis or for my master's experience was to acquire the knowledge and skills to become an effective clinical medical physicist. But let's start by focusing on the research goal. So to achieve our goal, Wayne and I started out by considering what characteristics our dose algorithm would need for it to be successful. And we knew that clinical translation would require it to be simple, fast, accurate, and also flexible enough to readily adapt to new treatment techniques and machines so that it wouldn't just become obsolete with the next technological advancement. And considering our whole checklist, this led us to physics-based analytical algorithms. And so what that means is that we systematically worked out the underlying physics driving each component of the stray radiation, which includes photons that leak through the treatment head, photons that scatter off of the treatment head in beam collimation, and photons that scatter within the patient. So then the total dose to the patient would just be the sum of all these various components. So for each component, we designed algorithms in consideration of beam divergence and attenuation through the various parts of the treatment machine and the patient themselves. And when all was said and done, we showed that we could calculate the absorbed dose both inside and outside of the therapeutic treatment field within 10% of measured dose magnitudes. And timing-wise, our model took under 5 minutes to calculate a whole body dose distribution. So for my master's research, we developed a physics-based analytical algorithm and found that it is possible to quickly and accurately calculate absorbed dose from both the therapeutic and stray radiation exposures with a training accuracy within 10%. So looking back to assess my original goals, I would say that we successfully showed that it is feasible to calculate whole body dose distributions for individual patients. And I also did acquire the background and practical skills to set me up for success as a clinical medical physicist. But I also learned through this experience that I really enjoyed research more than I knew when I set off on my training journey. And this also put me back at another point of needing to decide what my next step would be. And when I stepped back and took stock, I felt like my master's experience had really just sat right here. And although I had continued engaging in my various interests outside of work, I hadn't done a great job of integrating those interests into my work. And so, determined to do better, I applied for and received a Fulbright fellowship to study medical physics practices and healthcare disparities in Croatia. And so I spent just over a year in the capital there, working with some of the most inspiring physicists, people who are driven and are truly advancing the quality of care in their region. And outside of the hospital, I continued dancing and playing oboe and saxophone and exploring all the beautiful nature around the country. But then working with all of these all-star medical physicists made me realize that if I wanted to be an effective researcher and create the change that I wanted to see in the world, if I wanted to not only ensure excellent patient care today, but like my colleagues in Croatia, develop better patient care for tomorrow, then I was going to need more training. And so I returned to Louisiana to continue honing my skills. And again, I worked with Wayne Newhouser, but this time we focused on the other job of treatment planning systems, the optimization step. And so current commercial optimization methods optimize the physical radiation dose distribution as a surrogate for the true clinical goals of treatment, which are related to tumor cure and any possible side effects. And Wayne and I were interested in testing the feasibility of instead directly optimizing the clinical goals in consideration of all health effects, which of course requires us to take into account all of the dose. And my training goal for my PhD was to gain the research and teaching skills that would enable me to contribute to advancing our field. So again, focusing on our research goal, we've arrived again at this problem of needing all of the dose, which we had nominally addressed with my master's thesis, but practically speaking, our algorithm was actually just coded up in Microsoft Excel at that point. So really not the most accessible for optimizing true patient treatment plans. So the first thing we needed to do was find some way to make our algorithm more accessible and user-friendly. And for that, I applied for funding to travel to Munich to collaborate with researchers at the Ludwig Maximilian University for 6 months, where they had a research treatment planning system into which we could integrate our algorithm. So in collaboration with this other team, we got access to their research treatment planning system known as SIR. And just like the other commercial treatment planning systems I was showing before, SIR underestimated or neglected radiation doses outside of the treatment field. And so together, we came up with a framework for integrating our physics-based algorithm into their version of SIR to create an extended treatment planning system. And then we worked with the German National Standards Laboratory, the PTB, to validate the accuracy of our extended treatment planning system in a clinically realistic situation. And the clinically realistic situation that we chose was a conventional prostate treatment known as a 4-field box. And so we designed and delivered a 4-field box treatment to an anthropomorphic phantom, and we measured the dose throughout the phantom using thermoluminescent dosimeters. So here's a representative example of the dose distribution for that prostate treatment plan calculated by the standard and extended treatment planning systems. The grayscale is showing a CT image of the anthropomorphic phantom, and the color wash is showing the absorbed dose with the red isodose lines showing the low dose region at a higher resolution. And what you'll notice is that these dose distributions look identical if we look down where the beam paths are and where the target volume is. But as we go away from the target volume, we see a whole lot of grayscale in this standard calculation, which indicates that the standard treatment planning system is calculating no dose deposition. Whereas our extended TPS calculates dose throughout the entire rest of the phantom. But of course, our concern is how accurate is that dose that it's calculating. And so quantitatively, here on the x-axis, we have distance from the treatment central axis, and the y-axis is showing the relative absorbed dose on a logarithmic scale. The blue circles are showing you a series of measurements for detectors that we placed along the center of the patient, going from their pelvis up towards their head. And then the red line is showing you the dose calculated by our extended treatment planning system with a 1 sigma confidence interval. And you can see that the extended treatment planning system does a really good job of accurately calculating the dose, both inside and outside of the treatment field. On average, the discrepancy between calculated and measured dose values was just over 1%, which suggests that we didn't have any large systematic errors in our dose calculations. And our RMS deviation was just over 10%, so actually not too different from our training accuracy. And 10% might sound kind of large to you guys, but to place this in context, previously available methods of estimating out-of-field dose magnitudes had an uncertainty of around 20%. So we were pretty excited to be able to cut that in half. So once we had our dose algorithm in an accessible format, I returned to the US to consider our ultimate goal of optimizing health outcomes. And radiation therapy treatments can have a lot of different effects, some beneficial, like tumor cure, some detrimental, like second cancers. And these are all of different types and severity, and they might occur at different points in a survivor's lifetime. And so the real challenge in this project was in finding a way to combine all these effects in a way that ensures that the accounting is complete and meaningful. And we were able to achieve that by first translating everything into a common currency with what we call the figure of benefit and a figure of detriment. Now, these figures had 4 main ingredients. So first was the probability of an effect. How likely is that effect to happen to that patient? Next is the relative severity of the effect. So is it merely a cosmetic concern, or is it potentially life-threatening? Next were temporal considerations. So when is this effect likely to occur? Do we have to worry about it tomorrow or not for another 20 or 30 years? And finally, we left a spot for other factors. And so this gave us an opportunity to consider more subjective things that might still be important to a patient's decision-making process, like cost or access to care. Once we had all of our benefits and detriments into a common currency, we needed some way to combine all of them into a single objective function that could then guide a treatment plan optimization. And so to do this, we took inspiration from the commonly used dosimetric objective function, which at its core, it's really just the difference between the dose in the tumor and the dose in the healthy organs at risk. And so we represented our outcome-based objective function as the difference between our figure of benefit and our figure of detriment. Now, we tested the utility of our new objective function by using it to optimize treatments for 10 patients who had previously received treatment for prostate cancer. And specifically, we allowed the optimization to modify the direction that a beam would approach from, the total number of beams that made up the treatment plan, and the relative weighting of those beams that made up the treatment plan. And so in the end, we found that the outcome-based optimization converged on treatment plans that were unique from the dose-optimized treatment plans. So here you can see dose distributions for a representative patient with the conventional dose-optimized plan on the left and the novel outcome-optimized plan on the right. This is showing you the CT slice through the center of the patient's prostate. And again, the color wash represents the dose magnitude with high doses in red and warm colors and blue and cool colors showing you low doses. So what we can see is that the dose optimization tended to just want to spread that low dose as much as possible, or spread out the dose as much as possible. And so it tended to converge on solutions that had a lot of equally weighted beams. Whereas the outcome optimized plan would also penalize that low dose. And so it tended to accept higher doses in less sensitive structures and kind of minimize that medium dose wash throughout the rest of the patient. So for my dissertation, we developed an outcome-based objective function that could guide a treatment plan optimization on the basis of the clinical goals of radiation therapy. And we found that by optimizing the health outcomes instead of the dose, we could identify treatment plans that differed from the standard dose-optimized plans. Looking back at my original goals, we successfully showed that it is possible to directly optimize the clinical goals of treatment. And through that, I built a strong foundation in research skills. But we haven't yet talked about the second part of my training goal related to teaching skills. And so that was something that I found I largely had to pursue outside of my normal dissertation duties. And I did that through a couple of different avenues. So one thing I did was I sought out free online courses on pedagogy. And my favorite of those classes was this free online course called Advanced Learning Through Evidence-Based STEM Teaching. And I did look recently, like 2 weeks ago, and saw that the class is still happening and there's a session starting like right now. So if you're interested, go and register for it. It's a great course. And then to complement the coursework I was doing, I sought out volunteer opportunities to practice teaching. And my favorite of those opportunities was with an organization called Clubes de Ciencia. And that's a nonprofit that pairs international and local instructors to lead week-long summer science camps for students in low-resource settings. So what's really great about this organization is they provide a ton of teaching support to help ensure that your club is a success. And you also receive full financial support for your travel, stay, and classroom materials. And this program is also still going strong. When I did it, it only existed in Mexico, but now they've expanded into Peru, Brazil, and Paraguay, and perhaps even other countries. And I also checked, and at least for the Mexico arm of it, the applications are coming up due February 18th. So there's still plenty of time for you to apply for this if you're interested. I think the first time I did it, I found out like a week before the deadline. So still plenty of time to hop on that. Highly recommend it. And so with that, I called that a success for both of my PhD goals. And I also felt like I'd done a much better job of operating in this sweet spot at the intersection of my skills, interests, and values. And so my next goal was to just kind of keep that rolling. And the next step in an academic career is normally a postdoctoral fellowship. And so I went on the hunt for one of those. And I'm happy to talk more about exactly how I did that if you guys are interested. But in general, I drew on my network and my network's network to look for opportunities and get advice on strategic steps. And in the end, I ended up choosing to receive my postdoctoral training at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And that was largely driven by knowing that I'd have the opportunity to continue pursuing my passion for improving long-term health outcomes while also learning totally new skills in pediatric proton therapy. So with my master's research, we had worked to enable an improvement in long-term health outcomes by improving our knowledge of the physical radiation exposures. And then my dissertation research gave us a way to consider this link between the physics and the biology in treatment planning. But my dissertation work also revealed that there's still a lot to learn about this link between physical radiation exposures and their biologic effects, which is known as the dose response. And this relation is actually really complex, and it depends on a lot of different factors, only one of which is the dose magnitude that we're usually so focused on, and that we were focused on, frankly, when I was working on my dissertation. And so my first project as a postdoc was to instead focus on a lesser understood component, the linear energy transfer. And that's something that's thought to drive unexpected toxicities following proton therapy treatments. So my advisor and I were studying how various proton therapy treatment techniques affect the linear energy transfer. And we were running into this limitation of how we were analyzing our data. And this was really driven by a limitation of conventional methods to investigate dose-response relations. Namely that they typically rely on dose volume analyses. And that's where we would take the detailed, heterogeneous 3D dose distribution and combine it with our preconceived notions of which organs and tissues are relevant to a particular biologic effect in order to create summaries of the dose distribution. And then it's those summaries that we correlate with the effect of interest. Now, the problem is that this is inherently a leaky pipeline. So first, we lose any information on the dose in those organs and tissues that isn't already theoretically linked with an effect. And then we lose the detailed spatial information regarding how that dose, or in our case, linear energy transfer, is distributed within an organ or tissue. And pretty early on in my postdoctoral training, I had the opportunity to hear a presentation from an amazing scientist, Dr. Marianne Asnar from the University of Manchester. And Marianne was talking about voxel-based analysis methods. So voxel-based analysis methods, or VBA, offer an opportunity to overcome the limitations of conventional dose volume techniques and improve our understanding of this link between physical exposures and biologic effects. So VBA has two primary steps, where we first map the individual patient anatomy and the associated radiation exposure information to a reference anatomy. And then second, we perform voxel-wise statistical tests to identify correlations between radiation dose, or LET, and biologic effects. And these voxel-wise correlations indicate whether an overall association between the exposure and the effect exists. And it also highlights where within the anatomy that association is strongest. And so that can indicate possible functional subunits that might be driving that the occurrence of the effect. Now, Marianne had told us about all these really exciting results that have been realized through applying VBA to diagnoses and side effects that are common among adults, but they hadn't yet been applied to data from children, which tend to encompass wider anatomic variability and also unique diagnoses and side effects from adult populations. And so the primary research goal of my postdoc shifted to, for the first time, apply the VBA method to data collected from children. And my training goal was to develop the grantsmanship skills that I knew would be so critical to a career in research, and also take advantage of the fact that I would be working in a pediatric dedicated proton therapy clinic. So looking at the research goal, we identified an ideal population in which to test the VBA method's applicability to children. And this population was a cohort of 167 children with brain tumors who had previously received proton therapy at St. Jude. And what made this population so appealing for VBA was that they were roughly evenly split between males and females, and they spanned about as wide of an age range as you can get in any patient population. So it gave us a really challenging cohort to test the VBA method. So we had our target population, but we still needed some way to actually perform VBA efficiently. And so for that, I applied for funding from the AAPM to support a collaboration with Marianne's group in Manchester, who had an efficient platform for VBA. And so this grant funded me to travel back and forth to Manchester to work with them over the course of a year. And then at the very beginning of that year, of course, COVID happened. And so all travel was halted. But no problem. I was super bummed to not be able to travel. But we just pivoted and instead bought a server that lived at St. Jude, but that both groups could access and we could collaborate and work together. And all of this was definitely less fun than traveling back and forth to Manchester. It actually worked out really well. And so using this server, we started out by testing whether the first step of VBA, that spatial normalization or the mapping of individual patients to a reference anatomy, could be done in cohorts of children. And so here you can see some average images. So we just averaged the Hounsfield values in each voxel across all patients before and after that spatial normalization mapping. And then the sharpness of the average image indicates how well the mapping went. And these detail boxes in these images are showing you a soft tissue window level, and everything outside of that is in a bone window level. Now, you might be able to see some improvement in the sharpness from before to after the spatial normalization, but just qualitatively, it can be really hard to tell just how well the mapping went. But quantitatively, we saw anatomic discrepancies of less than 3 millimeters after our spatial normalization, suggesting that this step is feasible in pediatric cohorts. And so we moved on to test the next step in the VBA method, the voxel-based dose comparison. And we decided to start out with modified dose distributions to enable a systematic test. So we took each patient's clinical dose distribution and we replaced the dose values inside of their whole brainstem with a homogeneous dose magnitude. So their whole brainstem would have one dose magnitude, but that dose magnitude differed from patient to patient. So then we could run VBA knowing that we had introduced a systematic dose distribution everywhere in the brainstem, hoping that the VBA method would be able to identify that dose difference. So the results of VBA give you these significance maps. So here you can see the CT image of the reference patient, and then the various color levels are showing you regions where VBA identified a systematic dose difference at various significance levels. And remember, in this case, we had introduced a systematic dose difference in the entire brainstem. And you'll notice that these significant regions clearly highlight the brainstem. And quantitatively, the sensitivity of our analysis was nearly 100%. And so for my postdoctoral research, we showed that voxel-based analysis methods are applicable to data collected from children, despite large age-related anatomic variability. So circling back to my goals, we successfully applied VBA to data collected from children. And I also did a whole lot of grant writing, enabling me to virtually work with the University of Manchester. And I also worked exclusively with proton data and shadowed in the proton clinic. So I also achieved my training goal. But I also felt like I wasn't done with the work that I had started and wanted to do at St. Jude. So I ended up signing on to a faculty position, and I divided my time evenly between research and clinical effort. And so I spent the next 2 years continuing to work closely with the team at the University of Manchester to push VBA forward in children. And over that time, we studied whether using VBA to investigate side effects in the brain would require the high soft tissue contrast of MRIs in order to accurately achieve that spatial normalization. And we showed that there was no significant difference between VBA results using just treatment planning CTs, which are widely available and accessible, and MRIs that might provide more soft tissue contrast, but are much harder to get your hands on in the research setting. We also studied how to interpret VBA results in consideration of previous dose volume analysis results. And we showed that the VBA results were largely consistent with prior dose volume findings, but they also provided a wider context and more comprehensive insights. And finally, we began applying VBA to study cognitive effects and endocrine insufficiencies among children who previously received radiation therapy. And just when we were really rolling with VBA in children, I got a call from one of the people who I'd spoken to about postdoc decisions. And although I hadn't ended up working for him as a postdoc, he remembered our conversation and my desire to do all of the things. And he told me if that's still the case, then he had the perfect job for me. So this past summer, I transitioned to Thomas Jefferson University in Philadephia, where I literally get to do all of the things. So I now spend 80% of my time on academic endeavors, 20% of my time in the clinic. And in the clinic, we have like one of every type of machine and so many different procedures. And I'm really excited to be on the radiopharmaceutical team, which is still kind of a budding clinical service. So it's my clinical effort, but there's also a lot of exciting research going on with it. And then in my academic time, I get to do research. I get to do a whole lot of grant writing and manuscript writing. I still get to collaborate with my favorite group in Manchester. And I also get to build new collaborations with other departments and institutions and with industry. And really a big selling point for me in this program or in this new position is that I get to be involved in 2 training programs in our department. So there's a radiation oncology residency for MDs and also a therapeutic medical physics residency that I participate in mentoring and teaching. So I feel like I've finally arrived at a point where my Venn diagram is more cohesive than ever. My skills match my values support my interests, and my interests are enhanced by my skills. And of course, I still have things that I haven't yet figured out how to integrate into my work. So I dance on 2 different dance teams in the greater Philadephia area in my off time. But if any of you have ideas of how I can integrate dance into my work, please let me know. Maybe some form of like dance therapy for cancer survivors. I don't know. We'll get there someday, maybe. But I'm feeling pretty good about where I've gotten up to this point, and I'm super excited about where the future will bring me. And so with that, I'll acknowledge the village of people, the city of people who have contributed to all the various things that I've spoken about today. And I will thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions.
Thank you so much. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just was wondering about a technical question. What kind of server did you guys buy at Senju's? And is that sort of like yeah, anyway, what type of server?
That is a
Uh,
great question that I would have to pull out the like, do you mean like
yeah, you said
vendor
you
or like specs on
yeah,
it?
yeah, so you said COVID happened and then you couldn't travel anymore and then
Yeah.
um yeah,
So
and then you guys continued to collaborate using the data from the two
yeah.
different institutions, and
So
it was housed in Senju.
So I'm more than happy to share with you the details on exactly what we bought. I'm not a computer person, so I got a list of what we needed and a quote for it and bought it and then never thought about it again. But essentially it was GPU accelerated. We got the specs from the University of Manchester in terms of like what computing power was needed to run VBA. It is super like data intensive. It requires a lot of RAM, and then the GPU acceleration makes it feasible without that. I mean, running the VBA analysis would take, with the GPU acceleration, the most time intensive part is that first spatial normalization step. And that could take like over a day for our 167 patients. And, the goal in the future is to be running it on like 1,000 patients, right? So we tried to buy something that would support what we were doing now and also still be useful for our vision for where it would grow in the future.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But yeah, I'm happy to send you more specific specs if you want. I just don't know them. Sorry.
Cool.
So
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks for the question.
No
So
worries.
it's Mirta who wants to also ask you a few things. And I also wanted to thank you for the very interesting talk. And it was very, I think, illustrating. And thank you for sharing your experiences with all the students and all the advices that you are giving to them, because I think that will help them a lot to pursue their career as medical physicists. So Mirta, go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I have to start off by saying that I'm a Croatian national, so I was especially moved by your Croatian experience, and I'm very happy to hear that. I actually studied in Zagreb too, not specifically medical physics, but physics, and that's just amazing to see that was a part of your journey. I really appreciate your passion and holistic approach to integrate science and your work with skills and different things. And so that was really wonderful. And so
Great.
now my scientific question, if you can like comment a little bit on that correlation between the off-target dose and the secondary cancer induction, which especially children will be very vulnerable. I think, and even I remember in last May at U of T, we had this discussion. It's still a big controversy, if you talk about that in the scientific community, as far as I know. So if you can comment on that a bit more, especially how you can make claims for that patient population for children, and is that data coming from atomic bomb survivors, and like how do we make that correlation solid? Thank you.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for the question. It is really tricky. I showed the data that had found there was the highest incidence of second cancers were outside of the irradiated volume. The challenge with drawing conclusions like that, you present it simply in a presentation, but I also think it's important to recognize that, like, statistics wise, the irradiated volume is very small, and a lot of every patient's volume is not irradiated, so there's just a higher chance for them to arise outside of the irradiated volume. But I think the important point is that we do see higher incidences of second cancers among patients who received radiation. And so regardless of, and if most of those